Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for our final daily dose of Rivals of Ixalan spoilers. So we got the full set this morning, the whole Rivals of Ixalan set is out, so make sure to follow the link in the description over to the spoiler page, check out all the sweet new cards, let me know what you like, what you dislike, what you're most excited to play, but we have a few rares and mythics to talk about, mostly that snuck out late last night after our video, and then we're not really going to delve too much into the commons and commons. There's a couple on here, but for the most part, if you want to see all the commons on commons, there's just too many to talk about in one video, so check out the full spoiler page. Anyway, let's jump right into it, starting with the card I personally have been asked about more than any other from Rivals of Ixalan, and that is Blood Sun. So obviously, Blood Sun, 3-mana red enchantment, does something with lands kind of reminiscent of Blood Moon in some ways, but if you read what the card does, when it enters the battlefield, it draws a card, which is a huge upside. It really lowers the opportunity cost of playing this, because in the worst case, if it's bad or if it's a little bit slow, you're drawing a card, so at least it cycles, and then all lands lose all abilities except for mana abilities. So this card, the obvious comparison is Blood Moon, but I'm here to tell you, it's not actually a great comparison. So Blood Sun is a targeted hate card that also has some weird combo potential, like Solemnity, but it's basically targeted at a specific subset of lands. Blood Moon is a lock piece. You're basically trying to jank your opponent out of the game with Blood Moon. That's the most common way to play Blood Moon. So there's a very big difference there. Blood Sun is not great at, I play this on turn 2 when you just lose the game. That's what Blood Moon can do in a lot of matchups. Blood Sun doesn't really do that. There are situations where it can do that. If you play against legacy lands, for example, Blood Sun is really going to wreck their game plan. I'm sure there's other situations as well, but for the most part, they're very different cards with very different goals. So what does Blood Sun do? In Standard, it's really a targeted hate card for the legendary flip lands. So for example, Search for Iskanta, no longer cycling through your opponent's deck, impulsing every turn. It shuts down Field of Ruin, although it's oddly actually competing with Field of Ruin, which might keep it from seeing play. I think in Standard, Blood Sun is like a safety valve card. If we get to a format where Search for Iskanta, Iskanta the Sunken Ruins, the other flip cards, flip lands, are just dominating the format, then this is a card you play in your sideboard to shut down those specific synergies. Field of Ruin does give you a main deckable answer to those cards, which means the format really has to get pushed heavily towards these legendary flip lands before you really move on to playing Blood Sun. As far as Modern, there are some sweet things that Blood Sun does. So it shuts down fetch lands. Fetch lands lose the ability to fetch, which means you can kind of Blood Moon people in certain matchups. If your opponent's playing like 12 fetch lands and you can play this on turn 2, it might kind of lock them out of a lot of mana. On the other hand, the main purpose will be shutting down things like Valakut the Molten Pinnacle, shutting down things like Celestial Colonnade, creature lands. The problem is you still have Blood Moon, so I think most decks are still going to want Blood Moon, but there may be some exceptions. For example, Blood Sun can be an answer for a deck like Tron, as scary as that sounds, to shut down Ghost Quarters, to shut down Field of Ruins, to make sure you can't interact with opponent's Tron, and the way Blood Sun is worded, it doesn't stop Tron from making 7 mana on turn 3, because it's a mana ability, so it doesn't actually hurt Tron at all. It does shut down like Sanctum of Ugin, for example. You can't use it to tutor stuff up, but we could definitely see certain decks use Blood Sun as a way to protect their lands from Ghost Quarters and Field of Ruins, especially since it cycles when it enters the battlefield. The other cool thing about Blood Sun is you can use it as a combo piece. So for example, with the bounce lands, the Karoo lands from Ravnica, if you have a Blood Sun out, they still make 2 mana, but they enter the play untapped and they don't make you bounce a land. So you just can play a whole deck full of soul lands, which is really crazy when they don't have the downside of bouncing and coming into play tapped. So we'll see if anyone can harness the power of Blood Sun offensively to do some crazy things by negating the drawback of certain lands. So I don't know. I think that Blood Sun is mostly a safety valve card for Standard. It could show up in specific Modern decks, mostly to protect your own lands rather than to disrupt your opponent. Although, if the meta gets in some really weird place, you could potentially play it as a hate card as well. If you're really worried about dying to creature lands, for example, Blood Sun is an interesting option, especially if you're playing a 3 or 4 color deck that can't just play Blood Moon. But Blood Moon is definitely still the better lock people out of the game card compared to Blood Sun. Next on our list, we got a legendary dinosaur, Zakama Primal Calamity, and this thing is massive. 9 mana, you get a 9/9 with Vigilance, with Reach, with Trample. When it enters the battlefield, if you cast it, untap all the lands you control, and then you can pay 2 and a red to lightning bolt a creature. You can pay 2 and a green to destroy an artifact or enchantment, or 2 and a white to gain life. So the most interesting part of this card to me is it feels like it was worded for Aetherworks Marvel. So if you notice, it doesn't say if you cast it from your hand. It just says if you cast it, which is a really strange way of wording that. So if you can cast it with an Aetherworks Marvel or some other alternative way of casting it, as long as you cast it, you still get the benefit of untapping your lands. I don't think that Zakama is really standard playable. I think the main purpose of this card is to rank alongside Gishath's Son's avatar as the primary dinosaur commander. Not sure exactly which one is better. The abilities on Zakama are actually really, really strong in commander. If you play it for 9 mana, you untap all your lands, you can immediately activate its abilities 3 times, which means you can blow up 3 enchantments, for example, or shoot down a creature and blow up a couple enchantments. Worst case, you just gain a bunch of life, so it's a great mana sink. Plus, you can just play Zakama and then follow that up with another huge dinosaur, Waking Sun's avatar, Atli Primal Storm, a Gishath, any of those huge dinosaurs with the mana you untap, so it's kind of free when you cast it. So we'll see. I don't imagine that Zakama is really in the conversation as a standard card, but I think it is a great dinosaur commander and expected to be very heavily played because dinosaurs got a ton of support as far as being a commander tribe, and I think it's going to be a popular build around commander because it just does a ton of great things for that format. Next up, we have our last mythic, Twilight Prophet. So 4 mana, you get a 2/4 with flying, which is already not horrible, and then it has Ascend. So if you can turn on Ascend and get the City's Blessing, at the beginning of your upkeep, you reveal the top card of your library, put it in your hand, each opponent loses life, and you gain that much life equal to the card's converted mana cost. It's basically a reverse Dark Confidant. Yes, it's more expensive, but that's the easiest comparison. It's somewhere between Dark Confidant and Duskmantle Seer, except the ability is upside. You're not losing life like with Dark Confidant or Duskmantle Seer. You're actually gaining life and making your opponent lose life, so it's kind of a finisher in its own right because you're slowly draining your opponent out of the game, plus you're drawing extra cards. So I think this card is actually really, really insane. I don't know exactly where it fits. Probably the most easy home would be vampires in standard because there's a lot of vampires that put multiple things on the battlefield. Like Legion's Landing gives you the token and it gives you the enchantment, so that's 2 permanents towards Ascend. You're making your land drops. There's Legion Conquistador, Mavern Fiend can make a bunch of tokens. So it seems like in the right vampire build, it's possible that on turn 4 when you play this, you can already have Ascend, or at least by like turn 5, turn 6, counting your land drops. So you can get this turned on pretty quickly, and then you just have an insane card advantage engine that also works really well with the token deck. I don't know if you can find room in the token deck for this. You already got Anointed Procession in the 4-drop slot, but that's another deck that easily turns on Ascend. So I think basically, if you're playing any sort of deck that can reasonably turn on Ascend, Twilight Prophet is a really compelling option. So I think this card is very strong, probably a vampire staple in standard, and good even in non-vampire decks if you can constantly turn on Ascend. The only big question I have for it is how it competes with all the other strong 4-drops. So there's Hostage Shakers, Enchanter, Torch of Defiance, Bristling Hydras. Twilight Prophet is not as aggressive as any of those cards. Its ability is naturally slow because you got to get 10 permanents to get the City's Blessing. So whether Twilight Prophet can fight through Chandras and Hostage Shakers and Bristling Hydras outside of vampires in specific remains to be seen. But I think there's definitely a shot that this card has the potential to be very, very good, depending on what the format looks like, depending on someone finding the right build to harness its power. But if you can consistently turn this on by turn 5, it dodges Lightning Strike and some common removal, and then you just have an insane card advantage finisher. You're getting in for damage in the air all around. Very, very strong. Next up, we have Mastermind's Acquisition, which is one of the crazier cards from all of Rivals of Ixalan. So for 4 mana, you get to choose to tutor from your library or tutor from your sideboard, essentially, outside of the game, which means sideboard as far as tournament play is concerned. So this is basically literally Diabolic Tutor, also with Death Wish thrown in, which is super, super insane. Diabolic Tutor is as cheap as it gets for tutors these days. Wizards doesn't really give us 3 mana tutors anymore. So even just the first ability of Mastermind's Acquisition is on par for a tutor in standard, and that doesn't even include the upside of being able to tutor from outside the game and put that card into your hand from your sideboard. So it's like a Death Wish without the downside for just one more mana. You're not losing any life. So what do you do with Mastermind's Acquisition? So of course, people know how to use a tutor. So we're not going to focus on that. Instead, the wish aspect is really interesting. So probably the easiest way to think of Mastermind Acquisition's wish ability is to play a combo deck and be able to leave one of your key combo pieces in the sideboard, which offers some really interesting upside. So first off, you don't have to have Aetherflux Reservoir or Paradox Engine or Indomitable Creativity cluttering up your main deck, so you don't have too many copies in your main deck, but you can still access it when you need to, thanks to Mastermind's Acquisition. Plus, having the Aetherflux Reservoir in your sideboard means your opponent can't dispossess it. It means you don't accidentally draw and get it hit by a discard spell. It means your opponent can't Lost Legacy all your copies of Indomitable Creativity because you have one that's safely hidden away in your sideboard for when you're ready to combo off. The other thing is you can just play a bunch of one-ofs in your sideboard that maybe are too narrow for your main deck, like Consulate Crackdown, and you can still have access to them in game one by tutoring it up with Mastermind's Acquisition. Also, you can have a Fumigate in your sideboard, and you can tutor it up. A Pull from Tomorrow to close out the game with a huge source of card draw. So there's definitely a lot of potential for Mastermind's Acquisition. It's super unique, and it's really tricky to evaluate how good the wishing aspect is going to be, but the fact that it's already a Diabolic tutor means that it's definitely close to being competitive enough if you can find the right build for it. We also got Siegehorn Ceratops, which just makes me really sad. 2 mana, you get a 2/2. It has Enrage. When it's dealt damage, you get 2+1/+1 counters on it. Seems like a super sweet dinosaur, except it looks really bad in comparison to Long Tusk Cub. You don't need to go through any work. You don't have to do anything crazy to get the counters. Long Tusk Cub just naturally grows itself along with all your energy cards. So I feel like Siegehorn Ceratops is just pretty much unplayable outside of casual dinosaur decks. Of course, you can try to build around it. The big problem is, for Siegehorn Ceratops to grow the first time, it has to take exactly 1 damage, which means really hard to make it work in combat. You got to be playing like Riles, Forerunner of the Empire, Raging Regisar. You got to really build around the ability. Once it gets up to being a 4/4 or a 6/6, then it's pretty easy to keep it growing, but the challenge is getting in that first bit of damage for it to grow. So I don't know. My thinking is it's probably just too much work to make Siegehorn Ceratops work, especially since you have Long Tusk Cubs already competing for tournament decks, but it is a fun piece, a cheaper dinosaur if you're building a casual or just for fun style Enraged type deck. Can be a good 2-drop for that type of deck if you're already playing Riles and other ways to damage your stuff. We also got Warkite Marauder. 2 mana, 2/1 flyer. When it attacks, target creature defending player control loses all abilities and has a base power of 0/1 until end of turn. So this card, I think, is actually a pretty powerful pirate 2-drop. It reminds me a little bit of a lot of cards we've seen in the recent past. Rattlechain, Dimensional Infiltrator, Skyship Plunderer. Of course, it loses flash, but it gains another upside that we're going to talk about in just a minute. But we've seen 2/1 flyers, 4/2, be playable, and those were in formats without favorable wins. So we get the benefit of having favorable wins anyway, but I think the real purpose of this card is if you're playing straight blue-red pirates, it gives you a good answer to really hard to deal with stuff. Hazoret the Fervent, the Scarab God. These cards are really hard to deal with if you're not in black or if you're not in white, to have Vraska's Contempt, to have Cast Out. But with Warkite Marauder, you just attack, you make Hazoret into a 0/1, and make it lose all of its abilities, then you can Lightning Strike it, Magma Spray it, Harness Lightning it, use any normal removal spell that you're going to have in your deck anyway. So I feel like that upside is going to make Warkite Marauder really, really good for favorable wins decks, really, really good for pirate decks, especially ones that don't have access to black mana for Vraska's Contempt, and probably fine even ones with black mana, because it turns your Fatal Push into a Vraska's Contempt when it comes down to killing a Hazoret or a Scarab God or something. So while it might not look like much on paper, I think it's actually really, really strong, because it gives decks that normally can't deal with Hazorets and Scarab Gods really good ways of being able to deal with them without too much extra effort. Finally, our last rare, we have Hanada's Climb, which flips around into Winged Temple of Orzaka, and this is one of the more tame, I think, flip lands. So at the beginning of combat on your turn, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, and then if a creature has 3 or more counters on it, you get to transform it into Winged Temple of Orzaka, which lets you pay 1, a green and a blue, and give target creature you control flying and +X/+X, where X is its power until end of turn. So I think this is mostly a Merfolk/Explore type card. You can get some free counters with the Explore mechanic or other Merfolk abilities, Metallic Mimic, for example, to flip this around pretty easily. And then you have a for example, 5/4 Jade Light Ranger. For 3 mana, plus tapping your Winged Temple for Zaka, you just fireball that in for 10 damage in the air. Finally, Wayward Swordtooth is an interesting dinosaur 3-drop. So 3 mana, you get a 5/5. However, it can't attack or block unless you get the City's Blessing. So you got to get 10 permanents, but it lets you play an additional land on each of your turns. So this means it's kind of like a budget version of Azusa Lost But Seeking. You give up a land drop, you get a bigger body, kind of similar to Oracle of Moldiah, except you don't get to play the lands off the top of your deck. I think I'm mostly excited for this because Green-White Value Town, some of the collected company decks in Modern, are using Azusa to make extra Ghost Quarter land drops with Ramanok Excavator, play extra fetch lands, and Azusa's like $50 a copy. So while Wayward Swordtooth is a downgrade, if you're looking for a way to build this deck on a budget, having a $5 or $2, whatever it ends up being, Wayward Swordtooth is a huge deal if you're trying to build these decks on a budget. So I'm excited for that. You can also do the same tricks in Standard. You have Ramanok Excavator, you have Wayward Swordtooth. We don't have fetch lands, but you can keep getting back Evolving Wilds maybe to thin your deck. You can keep getting back Field of Ruin to mess with your opponent's non-basics, and you're kind of ramping yourself as you do that, getting the basics out of your deck. And then eventually, all these land drops are going to lead to you having a 5/5 for 3. So it'll be interesting to see how this works out. I feel like this is kind of an enchantment for the most part that lets you play a different land each turn. And then eventually, like turn 5, turn 6, turn 7, you have this creature that's actually somewhat relevant as a 5/5. So I'm excited for it. I think it could do some fun things, especially as a budget Azusa in Modern. Finally, we got a ton of commons and uncommons. I'm not going to go into all of them. Reckless Rage, cool dinosaur removal deck if you're trying to enrage. Grasping Scoundrel, give pirates another reasonable 1-drop. Crash of Tide's good for merfolk. Snub Horn Sentry, kind of the lowest wild Mikado of all time. But like I said before, if you want to see all the commons and uncommons, make sure to head over to the full spoiler page on the Goldfish site to check them out. Anyway, those have been our daily Rivals of Ixalan spoilers for today. So what do you think of the new Mythics? What do you think of Blood Sun? All the sweet new cards. What's your favorite card from Rivals of Ixalan? What tribe do you want to play the most? Let me know in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I will talk to you soon. Thanks for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, help us out by clicking that like button down below. And to keep up on all the latest and greatest, click that subscribe button. And don't forget to hit that bell icon to get alerts whenever we have new videos. And if you want to, check out some of our other sweet videos here and here.